Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Health Me Podcast, episode number 45. Remember to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any updates. This week, we had the opportunity to catch up with the principal scientist at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, where we discuss everything to do with performance and recovery. More specifically, we discuss some of the factors that make elite performers compete at a high level and how they change these factors for optimal recovery. During our episode, there may be terms you may not be familiar with. However, I try my best to explain, and I promise you'll be able to take something out of this episode today. Continuing on, our episode this week will include where energy comes from and the energy system involved with energy production, the role diet has on performance and recovery, what metrics sports scientists use to analyze athletic performance, how training load and specificity helps with recovery, and lastly, we highlight the idea of fatigue management and the essentials of fluid intake during recovery. This, of course, is not the only topics we discuss, and if you want to go back to a certain part of the episode, a full list of topics will be time-stamped and labeled below. Lastly, all the links to our guests and the Gatorade Sports Science Institute will be provided as well. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Eric Freese. Eric, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Mike, this is really exciting to be here. I appreciate the invite. It's been a long time coming, and I'm just super excited to be able to have this conversation today.
Yeah, we've had some back and forth over the past couple of months, and I'm really excited to sit down and discuss things with you. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about performance and recovery, of course. And before we get into that, I kind of want to just get your role, understand more of your role with Gatorade as director of sports science. I think the area of sports science is kind of vague in that there's so many different things you can do. And so why don't we just briefly discuss what you do with Gatorade and also your role as director?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off by saying I'm the director of a satellite facility within the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So the Gatorade Sports Science Institute is a collective of exercise physiologists, sports scientists, RD, sports nutritionists, a very wide array of talented individuals and backgrounds across all the different avenues of sport and performance. So our team is located across the globe. We have a group of individuals over in Europe, specifically in the UK. We have our main research laboratory outside of Chicago in Barrington, Illinois. And then we have two satellite facilities, one located here in Texas, where I'm located, and I head up the facility here. And then we have another one at the IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida. So my role has evolved over time, but in an essence, it's to ensure that the Gatorade brand is continually backed by science, to ensure that the ingredients that we're putting into products, the education and the scientific tools that are being delivered to athletes, whether it's elite athletes at the professional level or commercially through education content and advertising, is truly backed by science. It's the main pillar. Our brand, our product was found out of an athletic need, solved through a lab model that took those issues that athletes were having to solve into the lab, to bring it to the field and integrate it into athletic performance. And it's become a staple in the athletic industry since then. So we want to continue that scientific endeavor of ensuring that the brand is continually backed by science, and that we continue to have a lab to field model.
Yeah, and we need that, especially within the realm of, Gatorade's not it's a supplement, so to speak, right? Like in addition to your peak performance, it can help with that. And within the supplement area, it can definitely kind of get hairy in regards to like what people are actually producing and the efficacy and things like that. So I think it's good that Gatorade's trying to live up to the idea of sports science and so on. But to begin, when we think about the ingredients and the things that go into Gatorade, right, you have to understand basically how the body works. And I think the idea of how the body works is very complicated, but I think to start in a simple way, why don't we discuss where does energy come from for us to complete activities on a day-to-day basis? Like where does all this energy begin? Because I think if we understand where energy comes from, we can kind of stem off from understanding like what makes people recover better or perform better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit it on the head there. We need to understand, where where this energy sources are coming from and how our body utilizes them properly. And you said it right though. It's very, very complex, metabolically, physiologically, even the psychological components of food consumption. It causes a lot of strain, not necessarily on the body, but ensuring that we're making the proper food choices. So very broadly speaking, our energy and the ability to recover comes from the main macronutrients and micronutrients that we consume in daily life. The main fuel source for our working muscles are fat and carbohydrate. Now our body does a pretty, I would say, a great job at storing those components. We have a very large fat storage capability in our systems. Even in some of the leanest athletes in the world have the ability to rely purely on fat metabolism to go for very extended periods of time, versus when you're looking at kind of the elite and peak performance, that's where that really boils down to the ability to oxidize carbohydrates that are either stored within muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, or consumed over the course of whatever event it is that the individual athlete may be competing in.
Yeah. And I want to get into, you said that certain athletes use like fat and some athletes use carbohydrates, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, but perhaps, people think of macronutrients obviously coming from their food. What does the macronutrients turn into? And maybe this leads to a more philosophical question of like, what is the currency in the body? Like what do we use as the energy currency that allows us to do things on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, ultimately, all the energy that we consume is utilized to create ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, that is the turnover capability within the muscle. So the muscle utilizes that ATP, turns it into a phosphate and an ADP. Not to get too physiological there, but all of those macronutrient consumptions, excluding from protein, which really isn't a fuel source in a sense from the muscle, is derived from carbohydrate and fat consumption and storage capabilities. So I think it's twofold there. Like one is really the currency for, as you stated, for, energy within the body. But the other piece of that is that it's coming from these two macronutrients. So as, fat gets broken down, either through food consumption or storage, it's broken down into fatty acids, and that's used in lipid metabolism to ultimately enter the Krebs cycle and be utilized and created through ATP. And then additionally, carbohydrates, same thing, broken down into glucose, which we're all familiar with blood glucose from a diabetic and a health perspective, but that is the main fuel source that our body utilizes, the circulating glucose molecules. And during peak exercise, we have the ability to utilize the muscle glycogen stores that are glucose molecules combined together and stored with water within the muscle. And same thing with the liver. There's a storage unit for glycogen there. And once exercise peaks up, we have the ability to tap into those glycogen stores, which release glucose into our working muscles and into our bloodstream for utilization.
Yeah, and Eric's doing a great job of just very quickly going through many of the energy systems and like understanding like how ATP is made. But just as a if you're listening and you're kind of like, well, this is going way above my head, I just want you to understand that basically the currency in the body is like ATP. Like that is what makes allows us to do the things that we do, and this comes from the macronutrients. And again, this is super important because in order for us to understand the performance side of things, we have to understand the basis of where energy comes from. And in order for us to create ATP, there's like energy systems involved, and we don't maybe need to get into the specific details, but like, is there a hierarchical order in which, energy systems are used? Or do we use certain ones first? Or is there a way that the body needs to go through in order for them to reach to a certain point within a certain energy system? I guess maybe describe the hierarchical energy system that the body uses.
I think it's a great question. I think what you'll probably hear from me a lot today is that it's very context driven. It's very important to understand that our body is designed to have different capabilities across all these different energy demand states. So you mentioned kind of being activity specific or hierarchical. The key there is that when we're doing very long distance, low intensity type of exercise, that's where the human body has evolved from the hunter and gatherers of being able to walk long distances at a relatively slow pace, trying to hunt and gather food, berries, tubers, etc. That's been built into our energy systems for forever, and that is heavily relied upon through our fat oxidation and our ability to use these fat stores to create a robust amount of energy. But honestly, that energy system is very, very slow to create that energy. So it takes a lot of metabolic processes to turn fat molecules into that ultimate ATP in the energy space. Creates a lot of it, there's a lot of storage, but it takes a long time to get there. And if that's the case, that's not ideal for most athletic performances that are geared on being able to create energy very fast and very efficiently. And that's where carbohydrate tends to come in. So if you were to look at it across a spectrum of ultra marathon races where you're going to have to rely on fat oxidation for energy production, all the way down to running 40, 50, 60, 100-yard dashes, where you're going to use a little bit of fat, but the main energy source that's going to come there is going to be 90, 99% is going to come from carbohydrate oxidation. So it's very activity specific and context driven, if you will.
So generally, it's like short-term bouts of exercise, you're using more carbohydrates, and then long bouts of exercise, it takes a little while for the body to kind of get going to use fat in order for you to be used as an energy system.
Yeah, it's really intensity driven. So, our body is pretty efficient at creating or utilizing fat up to, about 45% of our max capacity, if you will. So if you understand a little bit about how our body utilizes oxygen to create energy sources, the maximal ability of our body there, if we're in that 40 to 45% of our maximal oxygen uptake capacity, we're really efficient. That's kind of the peak place that we can utilize fat for most individuals. That obviously does vary across, but that's a pretty standard state. And then, once you get across that 40 to 50% range, carbohydrate oxidation tends to kick up. It's pretty rare that it's, ever 100% one or 100% the other, because you're always going to be utilizing some mixture of the two, but the dominant systems will typically be in place across those two spectrums.
Now, if you train in perhaps you're an endurance athlete and you're using this oxidative system more so, will there be crossover in addition in helping perhaps other energy systems perform better, or even vice versa, where you're doing cross training? If you're doing sprints, will it help with long-term performance? Have you seen, is that something that athletes do or people do to try and help various energy systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a robust amount of research out there looking at how we can manipulate and manage through training or through diet these various energy systems, and how we can best become more efficient. Because at the end of the day, if you're looking at athletic performance, the goal is to finish the amount of work required, specifically in endurance type events, as fast as possible. Well, to do that, you need to be super efficient at creating those energy stores. And so, yeah, training across a spectrum of intensities can kind of help elucidate that. Now, when you're trying, I mean, we'll use endurance exercise as kind of a foundation here, and we can build and talk a bit about team performance if that's of interest. But when you're building that foundation of exercise capacity, you really want to increase your capabilities in that, in utilizing oxygen to create energy, which is, we've all heard mitochondria is, the powerhouse of the cell. So doing low intensity type of exercise where you can, build a robust cardiovascular system and increase mitochondrial content within, the working skeletal muscle, that's going to make you more efficient at maintaining that aerobic state, increasing your aerobic capacity, and being able to utilize both carbohydrate and fat oxidation as a source. The issue becomes where we start seeing an impairment in efficiency is when, we get into a state where we have to create energy through, anaerobic capabilities where oxygen is not present, and we have to, at very high intensities, use anaerobic glycolysis to, turn over glucose into ATP. And that tends to lead to an increase in hydrogen ions and lactate buildup, things of that nature that are going to impair performance. And, that it's not most individuals, especially as mere mortals, not the elite athletes quite as much, we struggle to operate in those conditions very well, where our muscles are not designed to be able to handle that. And maybe there's a pain tolerance thing there that kind of ties into it. So
there's certainly a lot of overlap, and you get really specific too, I'm sure, within team sports. I mean, you have to understand that the baseball players aren't probably going to be running 5 to 10 miles during their training camp, because it's not going to really necessarily benefit their specific sport. However, it could perhaps help them in the long term produce energy better because they have increased mitochondrial content in their muscles. And I guess the overall arc with this type of conversation is there is overlap, there is benefit to various things. But I think, would you agree that with the statement that, like, depending on the sport really will depend on like the type of energy system that you want to get more efficient at building up?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to that a little bit, there's a decent amount of research out there, that's come from, initially started with Martin Gabala out of McMaster University in Toronto, looking at the impact that, super high intensity interval sprints can cause, these aerobic adaptations at the muscle level, increase in mitochondrial content, et cetera. But you're nowhere near working at these like lower aerobic intensities. It's truly an anaerobic, all out 30 seconds, sprints where you kind of, they utilize these Wingate bike tests, 30 seconds all out, throw up afterwards. They're absolutely the worst. And you take 4 minutes of break and you do it again. Mm-hmm. You take 4 minutes of break and you do it again. And what's happening there is that during the exercise bout, it's purely anaerobic. It's too intense. You're not utilizing aerobic energy contributions, maybe for the last 5 seconds where you just ran out of anaerobic capacity. But as a whole, I'll never speak in absolutes, but as a whole, it's pretty anaerobic. But then in that 4 minute recovery period, you have to replenish all of those energy stores that you just depleted. You have to get the lactate out, the hydrogen ions out, and you have to replenish that ATP. And that's done through aerobic metabolism. So that increase there allows that. Now, when I think about that, I think about the sport of football, American football, not soccer globally. Right. But you've got these like very high intensity sprints, plays last between 6 to 12 seconds. Very anaerobic, a lot of power being produced especially at the lineman level. It's very anaerobic. Then they've got another 30 seconds to recover and do it again. And that's exactly what you're doing there. You need both energy systems to interplay together to be able to create the best athlete. And so where you spend your time focusing, there's probably a bare minimum threshold where across different positions in American football, you kind of need to have an aerobic capability, but they don't need to be aerobically capable similar to a marathon runner. They just have to have some minimum ability to recover between, and then they need to be as explosive and as powerful during the actual play that matters. So there's a fine balance there. You don't want to spend too much time in either space, but you want to know what the primary determinant is and being able to succeed at whatever skill or sport or position that you're trying to do.
Certainly. And how much does diet influence the efficiency, or at least the utilization of the energy source? I've heard of like ultra marathon runners, they'll do like an all fat diet, but then, I can remember back to some physio classes where it's like carbohydrates are like a rate limiting enzyme for, long endurance athletes. And so I guess, can diet really influence the utilization of the energy source within the body, or can we change it? Can we adapt? I guess, like, what does it look like?
Yeah, we definitely have an ability to adapt both through training and through exercise. And there's a lot of good research that Louise Burke out of Australia has done looking at the impact of ketogenic type diets, very low carb, high fat diets on elite performance, specifically like race walkers, marathon, ultra marathons that you're speaking about here. Because it did, that type of diet did take off in that space, because it makes sense physiologically when you discuss it. It's like, well, I can become more efficient if as I just alluded to, If you maintain your carbohydrate stores, you can kind of save them towards the end of these ultramarathon, longer endurance races, where then you can utilize it and have a better kick at the end. The more you spare your glucose, your glycogen, potentially the better you could be. But it seems that there seems to be an impairment, to your point, from a rate limiting perspective, that if you do go down that route, it doesn't seem to actually increase performance quite as much. We do shift our ability, and we can, utilize our maximal amount of fat. Oxidation tends to shift, as I was talking about before, where it's that 40, 45, 50% range standardly. You can shift that up to 70, 75%. But it doesn't seem to have an impact as positively in performance as maybe we could theoretically conceptualize. And I think that's the big difference, is that a lot of these things can be physiological or theoretical, if you will. But I think our body is really, really good at making those adaptations and kind of changing and balancing things out for us.
Yeah, our body is highly adaptable, but it's almost within this rigid framework of like the way we've adapted over the past several hundred years. So it's like we're flexible, but we're rigid at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Speaking on that, and this is kind of a side tangent here for you, but I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were talking a bit about how there's a couple hunter-gatherer areas that they still in the world today, and they walk miles upon miles upon miles, a day. And you would theoretically think that their energy expenditure would actually be higher than people in the Western world who sit here all day on Zoom and don't do anything. And what they found is actually that the body is really good at adapting, that at the end of the day, their total energy expenditure across the day is actually the same as ours, even though we just sit here and they walk all day. It's very bizarre, and I'm not sure I truly understand it, but it was quite interesting to listen to.
That is really interesting. It's almost like the body's trying to, be as efficient as humanly possible. Like, I've heard that walking, people think of walking as like an exercise a lot of the time. And certainly if you're, overweight or, don't really exercise, it's obviously something that you can do on a regular basis. But for people who are generally fit, walking is almost like a skeletal movement rather than actually using muscle. So do you think it's more of just like an efficiency thing?
Yeah, I don't think so, actually, because I think the data that they collected over there indicated that, you spend your entire life walking 8, 10, 12 miles a day, you would assume that you'd get more efficient at it. However, what they found is that it's not. The human body is just super efficient at base, and that we're capable of doing this, and that there doesn't seem to be an efficiency in walking based on that. Now, running and higher intensity things, you start to see these changes physiologically, biomechanically, that can increase efficiency. But it doesn't seem that in walking that seems to be true.
Well, this kind of leads into my next question. How much does genetics play in the role of efficiency of energy systems? I mean, perhaps that group of individuals is like they're from a long line of people who are really good at walking, I guess. How much does genetics play a role? And I know it's kind of a new area, so I guess you could speak to how much you know as well.
Yeah, I'll answer that by saying that that's not an area of expertise of mine. However, I will say I'll probably go a little bit more into kind of the athletic space, in the sense that you see individuals, and it's talked about on TV. You watch the Olympics that are going on right now, and you see or hear them talk about fast twitch, athletes, or slow twitch athletes. And it does seem that, while we have some ability to, change our, 2A fibers to type 1 fibers, which, very top line, type 1 fibers are super aerobically glycolytic. They're, those individuals who have a lot of type 1 fibers, ultramarathons, marathons, they'd be fantastic at, versus those type 2A and 2B fibers. Those are the fast twitch type of individuals who can create a lot of power, a lot of force, a lot of speed very quickly, but the muscles burn out super fast. They don't have quite that aerobic glycolytic capability that those type 1 fibers have. Now, if you take somebody and they're highly type 2 and you just train them endurancely, you're going to see some transition in those muscle fibers from 2B to 2A, 2A to 1. It's not going to be full, but you'll see a little bit of that. So genetics do play a role in kind of identifying like the baseline and where we start, but then also our ability to train and adapt across that spectrum. So if you're truly a type 1, it's going to be pretty hard to go back the other way. And it tends to be something that we all kind of figure out very early in our lives. You either kind of know I'm either fast or I'm not, and I should probably go run long distance. I'm good at this skill, I'm not at that.
Right.
So it seems to be like as humans, we're pretty good at identifying our strengths and our weaknesses, but there is a lot of research in that space. That's quite interesting. Not something that I have a whole lot of expertise in, though.
Yeah, well, and just to kind of summarize, type 2 are like fast twitch, like you said, and these are people who generally can produce more power and more strength. And then type 1 fibers for the muscles are ones that you can do for longer periods of time. And so just think in the sense of like when people are born, they have either perhaps a more genetic trait to have more type 2 versus type 1, or they're able to produce more power, or they're able to do activities longer. And that's why you may see genetic variances. So like when you're a kid growing up, there may have been a kid who was way stronger than everybody for no apparent reason. He may have had more type 2 fibers. But again, it's an interesting area. I talked to someone who does nutrigenomics and just talked about that. And it's definitely an interesting field that continues to get more and more weight. And I'm sure, especially in professional sports, people are going to start to learn more and more about it, because if it gives people a competitive advantage, people will know about it.
Yeah, it seems like the opportunities potentially, and I don't know this for sure, but I've heard that certain countries start utilizing that type of testing early on to identify that to pinpoint where people are really good at, and can kind of train them for that
Right.
long-term athletic success. We've all kind of heard those stories, but yeah, it's truly very much in its infancy, and I think even like exercise physiology, sports nutrition are truly in their infancy when you look at just the swath of literature and other fields. Neither of those fields are even 100 years old. You even see sports nutrition is even shorter than that. I mean, exercise physiology started out of the Harvard fatigue labs in the 1940s, and it was really kind of military-based research, and that's just the beginning of it. We're just now kind of getting to the point where, from a capability standpoint and an understanding, that we can really start building upon additional literature pools, to start making some major moves in this space. And I think that's super exciting for the future.
For sure. And, we've been discussing kind of the energy systems within the body to kind of create a framework of how to improve performance. And in order to understand how to improve performance, it's really important to understand like what variables do we need to improve. And I guess what metrics do you use to monitor performance, and maybe tools to help measure and collect data?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different tools and capabilities we can utilize to monitor performance. And once again, it's very context driven. It's going to depend on the athlete. So I'll kind of spread this out. And I spoke briefly on this a couple minutes ago, as far as kind of our maximal ability to utilize oxygen. Well, one of the main determinants um, of endurance type of athletes would be understanding their maximal ability to utilize oxygen, which would be a standard VO2 max test. And that's one way to monitor changes in training adaptations and performance. It's not a true indicator. If we lined up 15 athletes with the exact same VO2 max, they're not going to finish at the exact same time. And people who have slightly different lower VO2 maxes may beat the people with higher VO2 maxes as a whole, but there seems to be like a threshold for where elite athletes are going to have to be at this point. And then it comes down to, as we talked about earlier, the ability for them to be efficient in their physiological and biomechanical capabilities. So very briefly, it's very broad across different athletic paradigms. And we're in February right now, and coming up will be the NFL Combine. And that is a true performance test for, the football athlete. However, I would argue those probably aren't the best indicators of true performance on the actual field. So sometimes there's a disconnect between, the tests that we can do, whether they're in the lab or in the field, and what actually happens on the athletic, field, if you will. So I think sometimes, we try to utilize some of these performance metrics to understand how athletes are adapting, but I think we need to take a back seat and understand that these are just tools for us to provide direction. It's not saying that this athlete will then all of a sudden be better than this athlete because of this one true test. We're not at that point by any stretch. So to kind of circle back around, some of the things that we utilize in our lab, especially in team sport athletes, one thing that we'll do is we'll do force plate assessments very useful tools to understand, the ability for team sport athletes, football players, basketball players, soccer players for generating force. And what they'll do is they'll stand on these force plates and they'll just do repeat jumps as fast as they can. We can determine how quickly they can take off, how much force they're generating when they jump. And then we'll do a series of tests to understand their reactive strength index. So how quickly can they jump, and then how quickly when they land can they get back up. So when you think about basketball, that's super important as you're jumping up for repeat rebounds over and over again, or you just try to take a shot and then you got to go right back up. That ability is a pretty good indicator of how they stand from a performance perspective. And then when you get into football space, you've got completely different athletes from defensive backs and wide receivers who are very fast twitch, very capable of running fast, jumping high, etc. And then you've got 350-pound offensive and defensive linemen. If you ask them to jump, they're going to say, I don't want to do that. That makes absolutely no sense. So instead, we'll have them do isometric mid-thigh pulls, where we'll use the same technology, but we'll just put a barbell over the top of it, and they just have to rip up as hard as they can. It's isometric, so the bar doesn't move. It's going to stay completely still, but as they pull up, it pushes the force down into that force plate, and we can detect that. And that's a great way to kind of understand where they are at from kind of a performance and a force production perspective. There's a whole host of other types of technologies and tools, and it goes back to the fact that it's super context driven. You have to be very specific on what are you trying to capture? Do you want to understand the adaptations to an aerobic endurance training program? Basically, do you want to understand if they're getting stronger? Well, back squat and bench press are prime indicators of understanding whether somebody gets stronger. So it's very, very context driven, and it's going to depend across what type of athlete you're working with and where you're trying to pull and what changes you're trying to influence in them.
Well, I'm sure, and it's just a way to standardize, right? Like, how do you take so many different athletes from all over the U.S. and be like, okay, who's better and who's not, right? And I'm sure there's other measurements of like just mentality during a game, right? Someone can be the fastest and jump the highest or whatever, but say they get into the field, they don't know how to use it appropriately. Perhaps they don't have a good game sense of where to be on the field. And I'm sure that both obviously hold a lot of merit, but putting them together and making sure you have good combination is probably really essential as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. And it points to the difference between, true, performance capabilities and game speed, game quickness, et cetera. Like those are different things. And I'll keep using football just because it's an area of interest and passion. And we've done some work in this space. But, you got wide receivers, you can run a 4.3, 4.25, whatever it is. But if they can't run that and get in and out of their routes with somebody next to them, it doesn't really matter. And I think the great tool and technology that's come out in the past, decade or so have been the GPS trackers that, several different companies from Catapult to Stat Sports have done, which allow you to monitor in game and in training, performance capabilities. And those are the things that, where you get athletes running at 97, 98% of their true max speed. If you're just line them up in a 40, like that person is going to be better than the faster person who can only run at 60 to 70%, for example. So that's just broadly, it goes back to that context like we're talking about. And I think that's the exciting part about understanding and trying to unwind all of this.
Yeah. And we're also talking about performance and standardization of performance. And, part of performance is understanding the factors that go into it. And I think two interesting places that people spend a lot of time thinking about it, and also maybe our buzzwords are training load, but also nutrition. And at high levels, it's interesting. And we've been talking about food. So I'm curious to know, does food quality determine performance overall? I mean, I've seen a lot of athletes who've like gone down this like extremely like specific diet route, and even like ultra marathoners, like they're eating a specific way. But I've seen a lot of professional athletes who they have a terrible diet. I've heard, and I use the example in some of the questions is like Chad Ochocinco. He ate terribly, but he obviously was one of the top performers in the wide receiver position. So I guess like, have you seen a significant difference in like athletes changing their performance with nutritional changes, or does it matter? Does genetics play a bigger role sometimes? I guess like, what would you think on that?
Yeah, that's a very challenging question to answer, because I think you hit it on the head. There's probably enough out there where you could point out athletes who may not have Yeah, or actually really probably eat awfully and still perform at a very high level. I have a colleague who she mentioned something one time that really stuck with me, and it's athletes actually don't have great diets. Truthfully, like an athletic diet is probably not great overall. It goes back to the fact that these athletes have to fuel for the work that they need to require, and being able to consume the amount of food that they need to support the energy demands that they're going through may require that they don't eat super well, to be honest. I think every time the Olympics rolls around, there's either some swimmer, some endurance runner, Usain Bolt, who just ran the 100, talked about all he did was eat chicken nuggets for 2 weeks leading up to his race, because he thought that was going to be the best from his gut perspective. He was afraid to do anything else,
Right.
but he could still go out there and perform. So I think some of this you kind of have to figure out how to kind of tease out between, maybe this person is, to your point, just genetically well advantaged compared to a lot of other individuals, versus individuals who may not be as genetically advantaged, where nutrition really could play a role, and dialing that in properly, getting the right amount of protein to support muscle breakdown, and to ensure that they're recovering properly, or that they're consuming enough carbohydrate to replenish those glycogen stores, and truly support the fuel that they need to do that work, and maintaining the fat levels that can help with hormone production. Like, all those things are important. It's not saying that there's definitely going to be elite people that they can do what they want. That is always going to be the case, and they're going to be elite no matter what. But there's a group underneath that you're fighting for that top spot, and doing everything right, and dabbling in some of the different legal supplement spaces could tip that over the edge. It's not going to give you 95%. You can't, me personally, I can't just all of a sudden eat well and then I'm going to go be an Olympian, for example. That's not the thing, right? Yeah. They've got that 99% ready to go, and it's just that last 1%, and that 1% matters for those elite people. So, and very long-winded answering, where I think it depends truly whether or not food quality does change the quality of performance for athletes. But I do think that the more you kind of dial that in, the better off it's going to be. It's one of the few behaviors that we have that we can truly control. At the end of the day, we can control what we eat, we can control what we drink, and we can control how much we sleep. We can try to control some of our stressors. Some of them are out of our control. I've got 2 little kids. My stressors are well beyond anything not within my control. But as a whole, those are kind of the things that we have the ability to kind of change our behavior in and around. And I think that has to be highlighted and understood from a performance perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's why I brought nutrition up to begin with, just because it is the most modified one that you can change, right? Like, if you have someone who's circling back, you have someone who's a strictly type 2 person from day one, and they've been training perfectly from the time that they were a kid up to the point that they're in the NFL or in soccer or whatever. For that person who may be a little bit less than type 2, they're still really good, but they're not that 5% better. Maybe that nutrition can bring them up to that level, so that way they can perform similar to that guy who may be just a genetic freak, and someone who's really going out there with everything working well.
Yeah, no, I think you hit that right on the head. It's figuring out what that 2 to 3% can do, and if that's worth it for you. And even kind of coming back to this, there's definitely people who are at the peak of their physiological capability, but that wanes over time. And when you look at professional athletes, you come out, you're 22, you're 23. I mean, I know what I felt like when I was 22 and 23. I could do almost anything, and I was fine the next day. Nothing really affected me. But once you 25, 30, 35, and look what Tom Brady even recently did, that's where paying more attention to your diet may be even more impactful, because now you got guys 20 years younger than you. They recover faster. Their bodies are just more efficient than yours at that point. Age and father time plays a role in that. And that's probably where the opportunity at the professional level, that it really can make a difference. And that's where you'll start seeing individuals really start paying attention. And I'll use LeBron as an example here. I think early on in his career, he probably didn't talk about a whole lot of that, but as recently as a couple of years ago, he was talking about he was spending $1 million a year on recovery. Now, I don't know how he was kind of breaking that up. I don't think that was all on recovery modalities, but I assume that was chef and massage and like all these other things that play an important role. He wasn't doing that when he was 18 and he first came into the league. He was just him. And so I
Right.
think you kind of have to adjust that over the course of a lifespan of a professional athlete.
Yeah, I was actually going to say LeBron when we were talking about Tom Brady, but it's a perfect analogy. And another controlling factor that we can use is training load, athletic training load. And real, it's been, and you mentioned this in one of your talks, talking about just training load, and people have been kind of using load management, volume management, almost as like as a buzzword, and you see it in news articles and so on. Maybe what is like training load, and when does it begin? Like when should athletes and coaches really think about starting to consider like training load as a way for athletes to perform better? Because middle school, and like we had just talked about how when you're young, you're adaptable, like you can do a lot and not have to worry about recovering. But I guess like when should you really start to think about like training load and making sure that you're recovering well enough?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it really depends on what the goal is. And if the goal is geared towards performance versus just general growth and adaptations, I think that's when you really need to start focusing on that. That might be more at the collegiate level than it is probably at the high school level. Maybe at some elite academies where you've got kids purely training for an athletic endeavor and they want to make it to the next level, then I think it could be important. But I think until that next step is taken where your life is fully devoted towards that sport and craft, it's probably not as important at those earlier levels. I also question, as kind of a sidebar here, at the lower levels if they really have the ability to track, monitor, and then make the next step in interpreting and translating that into impactful decisions. The load monitoring space is very much in its infancy, and I think right now we're at a point where we're not entirely sure. We have the ability to track a ton of data, especially as these GPS units have become more mainline, but I'm not sure we fully understand the implications of being able to take that data and make that translation and adapt training, for example. So I think that's something that we have to be careful with. So to kind of get back to the first part of your question, though, what is training load at the end of the day? And it's really everything from a physical perspective that an athlete may endure. So let's take the professional athlete, for example. They're going to come into a facility in the off season, and they may have skill training, they may have weights, they may have some sort of aerobic conditioning session, whether that's sprints or something longer, depending on what it is. Take baseball, for example. You got pitchers going out, to training camp whenever, or spring training, whenever they make the deal that's going on right now. They're going to go out there and they're going to start by throwing a couple pitches, and they're going to step it up and they're going to ramp it up. That's just a version of kind of load monitoring and slowly ramping up an athlete. Can't take somebody, who hasn't been doing anything for a couple months and just throw them in the deep end. You got to prepare their bodies for the work that they're going to be doing. And at the end of the day, the knowledge that gives us is that it allows us to periodize their training to get them into a position where they're ready to go at the beginning of the season. And it allows us also to make sure that we can understand when should they peak. Professional athletes right now are at a point where they got to peak a lot. There's a lot of different times they need to peak, and you can't sustain that over a long period of time. That's very challenging. And you don't see elite marathon runners going out and running a marathon every single weekend. You just can't compete and continue to maintain that level of performance. But we do ask professional NFL athletes to go out there and compete at the highest level every single Sunday. So you got to understand across, how do you get them week one that they're as prepared as they can be. That may not be peaking then, because you want them to peak and be ready to go at the end of the season, but understanding what it took to get there, what they do during that week, and then how you can manage their load over the course of that week. The second piece of that, and this kind of goes back to the food piece and the nutrition side of things, is that the more we can understand of what an athlete is doing, the better we can be prescriptive in giving them quality information about how much they should be consuming. And I've said this a couple of times, but fueling for the work that's required by the athlete is highly important. So being able to understand how much work they're doing and being able to match that from an energy expenditure piece or an energy intake perspective is going to allow them to maintain their balance, their um, uh, maintain their weight, maintain their homeostasis, all those different types of things so that they can recover better over the course of weeks, of seasons, of their life, etc.
Yeah. And all these factors, it takes a team, like, and at the professional level, there's so many people who are involved trying to make sure that all these factors are going well. And I find it funny sometimes that I see like high school coaches or strength and conditioning coaches who say, we're managing load. I'm like, are you managing load, or are you speculating? And so, what should this conversation be like between coaches, athletes, or even rehab about training load? I mean, should we even be having conversations about it outside of like the professional setting, or is this more of, is it because it's so in its infancy that maybe we should be waiting for more research about like how to appropriately load? In my realm for rehab, injury prevention is what I focus on and getting people back to where they were before, but it's it's balancing pain in addition to training load, and I try to manage just like basic sets and reps and like frequency throughout the week. And so, but do you think that we should be even like thinking about this right now, or do you think we should still wait for more research? I guess, what are your thoughts?
I think we should be having the conversations, and I do think that I think most coaches probably have the right frame of mind, is that they're trying to get athletes bigger, faster, stronger. um, the way people go about that can be very different across all walks of life. And even in the recovery set, in the rehab setting, you're trying to get somebody from point A to point B. They come in with X, want to get them walking and out the door and capable of doing daily living activities, or get them back in a position where they can re-enter into sport, whatever that is, that end goal. You need to know what that end goal is, and you need to work backwards from there to that starting point and understand how can you get there. That in and of itself is load monitoring. But how do we utilize the data to inform decisions? That is another avenue that I think from a strength and conditioning perspective is probably there. We understand how to periodize strength training, and that you can't just continue to ramp up over the course of 4 months training load and weight and volume and et cetera. Like the body's just at some point going to kind of peak out there. You need to detrain, take a deload week and be able to allow that super compensation where you kind of come back fitter and stronger all of a sudden because you gave your body just a little bit of rest. You overstress it, you take it back, go back up. And I think that figuring out how to exactly to do that and dial that in, I think the big piece of it could be where coaches may not be talking super well to each other. In a professional setting, it's all under one house, but it could be in different settings. And I know this was the case when I was in high school, and I had to have a coach come back and tell me like, hey, you can't be doing this. But I'd go to baseball practice right after school in the spring, and then we'd have open gym for basketball at night. And I was doing that, and at some point, my coach was just like, "You're just tired. Like, just stop. Like, you don't need to go." And I was like, "That's fair. I was just I'm trying
Right.
the hardest here. I'm
Yeah.
standardly athletic dude. Like, I got to do my best here." So sometimes it just takes that kind of communication. And you've got the strength coaches, you got different skill coaches or the head coaches of the sport, et cetera. Like, there needs to be some level of communication between those two. And I think everybody's just trying to tweak it out as best as you can.
And ultimately it's to recover and make sure that you're not fatigued all the time and you're performing at your best. And, what are some factors that you look for to indicate that people are recovering well? Like what are some, in order for us to understand even what recovery is, we have to understand what we're looking for. So like, what are things that you look for in athletes to make sure that they actually are recovering versus just like a subjective saying like, I feel great?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I actually would say that subjectively, we're pretty good at identifying where we are. And one thing, deep into the research, you could probably get into some spaces where there's, 30, 60 session or 30 to 60 questionnaires, however you say that, where you're really trying to understand how people and their mood is. And I'll use like the PALM scale, profound mood state scale, is a perfect example. That's actually a pretty good indicator of energy and fatigue levels for individuals and can be used in athletic setting. However, 30 questions is really hard to answer for any athlete, really. Like, who really has time to answer that, especially in today's world? Like, I don't. Like, so how do we get better about asking those questions, using 1 to 5 Likert scales and just understanding like, hey, are you ready to compete today? Are you ready to perform? Like, how do you feel? Like, what's your energy level? Are you sore? Are you tired? They come up with a couple different questions like that. You can get a pretty good understanding if you have the trust built up with the athlete for them to tell you exactly how you feel. That trust factor has to be there. If they don't trust you, they're just going to lie to you and say, I'm energized and ready to go. And that may not be the case. And in that case, it's really good to have some true data to back it up. And there are different performance assessments that we can utilize to do that. I briefly mentioned before those force plate metrics. Weekly assessments of force plates in professional settings is utilized. And, a couple of days after a game, you can kind of tell, from a force level production that the muscles are recovering quite well. We're getting back into that space where we're not 40-50% below where we were pre-game day. That can be a pretty good indicator of like, hey, we're ready to kind of go back into training and get ready for the next week. So we typically know that 24, 48, 72 hours, depending on the sport, is usually about where recovery usually takes. And we're always interested in understanding how nutrition can kind of play a role in speeding that process up, and getting athletes into that position to go back out and train properly. But I do think that there are some avenues for monitoring that to answer your question, I think is an opportunity. And another area we could get into would be looking at how hormonally people are responding to. There's some indicators, that some biomarkers that we can capture through blood, through saliva, and sometimes through urine, that we could detect and understand how people may be recovering. I think the research is still fairly preliminary there, but being able to look at testosterone, cortisol, CRP, things of that nature can paint a pretty good picture of how stressed the body is feeling. We know that after training and after intense, competition, that there's the chance that testosterone goes down, cortisol and CRP go up, and periods of continuous high training, you can see that the ratio of testosterone to cortisol starts dipping as well, or going up as well. So I think we need to figure out. The research is still pretty preliminary in how to make that super applicable to the individual athlete, compared to the general population, where you go and get a blood draw and you can say, well, hey, your testosterone, your cortisol, or these different blood biomarkers, glucose, for example, is outside of the standard range. We don't have that for professional athletes, and you really have to look at it at an individual level and get good baseline numbers and understand, like, hey, over the course of the season, we really saw you starting to tweak and adapt. That's not something we can just go and do it one time and be like, yeah, you're not ready to go. So it's got to be very personalized and individualized for the athlete to be able to utilize those.
Yeah, and hormones change so rapidly. Like if you take blood work on a Monday, your blood work's going to look rapidly different than a Friday or after a game on Sunday. So it's difficult, and you need to have a continuous monitoring of that person who's doing these things, so that way you can take that full year and be like, well, this is what happened, this is what you look like. This next year, let's try and change that and see what happens. And sometimes it changes, sometimes it doesn't. So from the perspective of research, I can't imagine the difficulties of trying to understand it and trying to figure out what are the best things to do and implement in athletes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you have to be very standardized in the way that you collect it. If you collect it we go back to the blood and saliva biomarkers at 8 a.m. one time, and the next week you collect it at noon. Even if it's on the same day, there's a lot of fluctuations across the day that can cause adaptations there. So, and it's got to be context driven. I don't think we're at the point where we can just utilize one marker in any athlete monitoring program to indicate anything as it relates to performance or recovery or fitness. You have to use a host and a variety of different pieces and put that puzzle together properly. So, combine the perceptual piece, how does the athlete feel with, what maybe their blood and their biomarkers are telling us, with what they're feeling like or how they're performing neuromuscularly, whether that's captured through force plates or treadmill tests or just running tests, whatever you want to do. There's a lot of different avenues to do it, but you have to piece that puzzle together. And that makes it very challenging, because that takes a lot of resources. So, identifying one or two things that are super impactful for, your organization, whatever athletes you're working with, I mean, that's going to be the key. I think even, from a rehab perspective, individuals come in and, you're probably going to do a host of different initial tests just to get a baseline on them. But if you had to work with 20 athletes at the same time, do you have capabilities to do all of that at the same time? Maybe not. So you have to be very strategic about how you go about that.
And fatigue is obviously something that you're going to have to deal with. And much like training volume and training load, you have to manage it throughout a season. With fatigue, there's got to be obviously your ability to is there an appropriate amount of fatigue that you should have? maybe I'm not wording this correctly, but should there be an understanding that you're not going to always 100% recover, and we're going to have to be able to realize that there's going to be fatigue involved, and there's going to be not adequate recovery all the time. Some people are going to have bad nights sleep, and so is it more about just like managing that fatigue and managing it and understanding how to basically make sure you're recovered at the most appropriate time?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. At the end of the day, I'm not sure we ever fully recover or go back to homeostasis if you were
Right.
to define homeostasis as the previous state. Because at the end of the day, any training, any competition is actually meant, our body should respond to that. We should either get bigger, faster, stronger in some sense of the word. Now, in elite and professional sports, it may get to a point where we actually never get back to that early state until there's a long period of rest and we go into the next year. And it
Mm.
could be detrimental, which is why off-season training can be so important to kind of get the body back primed and ready, and back in a position where they can, create the same power, have the same, aerobic, anaerobic capabilities. Like that can be important. So no, I think you're very right. Like I don't know if we're ever going to be fully back. It's just getting it back to a place where we can still compete and perform at the level that's required. And understand that in the same sport, hopefully the other team is dealing with the same issues. The other athletes are doing
Right.
the same thing too. So it's not, I guess technically you could be looking at, I mean, use the NBA or NFL or MLB. Another team gets a day off before they play you, or a travel day impacts it, or a bye week, whatever it is. Like those things, do have those impacts, and gives you that additional ability to maybe recover, get a little bit healthier than the other team. So
Yeah, and some people sometimes a detriment like this. Like we got the Super Bowl, and some people hate the 2 weeks in between, right? Because it's like I'm in this flow state, like we got all this energy, we got the energy of the city, but now we got 2 weeks in between. There's a lot of things that can happen in 2 weeks. You're excited, you got the Super Bowl coming up, maybe it's your first time in the Super Bowl. A lot of things are probably going to be contextualized, and also if you're stressed about it, it could build even more over the course of 2 weeks. So I always found it funny that it takes 2 weeks for you to finish your championship in the NFC and the AFC, and then get to the Super Bowl. I wonder how much that plays in actual and player effectiveness and playing, and what it would look like if they actually just had it the week after.
yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think it goes back to the fact that performance is, so multifaceted. It's not, we've been talking a lot about the physiological, and the biomechanical piece of it, but psychologically, it's also very hard to kind of manage those things. And, anybody who's been in an athletic setting before knows that some days you just have it, some days you don't. And you just hope that you show up that day and you have it. And you can see that in the Olympics. I mean, people have, it's going on right now. You have people who have trained their entire lives to get to this point, and it just have a bad day, and you can't describe it. You did everything right, and it happens. You hope it doesn't, but sometimes that's all you can do.
Now I know you're working with Gatorade, so this might be a little bit of a biased question, but post activity, like what should your fluid intake look like in order for you to adequately recover? Like should we be constantly taking fluid intake throughout the game and in a sport in order for you to continue to recover adequately? I mean, sometimes if you're in the game for a long period of time, similar to soccer, you're not going to be taking in any water up until halftime, or if you come out of the game. And so I guess like how much does a role does fluid intake play, or is it obviously like many other things, it's just very person specific and sport specific?
Yeah, it's very, very personalized, and I think it's really important. And the capabilities are now starting to be pretty broad and democratized, that being able to understand how much you personally sweat. There's a lot of variability across individuals, how much you sweat, between half a liter to a liter and a half. Not only you as an individual genetically, the sport that you're doing, the activity that you're doing, the environment that you're doing it in, all dictate how much sweat you're going to lose and what your sweat's composed of. We all have very individualized electrolyte losses, sodium specifically, in an individual. So being able to specifically understand what your sweat rate looks like is super important. And at the elite level, you'll see a lot of athletes weighing in and out before training sessions and before competition and after competition, and being able to dictate how much weight they lost is mostly water weight. You got to assume they're consuming some foods and fluids across it, but that's mostly going to be water weight. And then you can, prescribe them to consume 150% of that back in body weight. So fluid and body weight, therefore then kind of super replenishing them to a point where they're going to show up tomorrow hydrated. And there are scientific methods of being able to do this super specifically. We have capabilities of understanding what individual sodium losses are during a session, and then being able to prescribe specifically how much fluid and how much sodium they should be consuming during an activity to maintain their performance level. And I think that it goes back to the point that you want to, everything is about being able to perform at your highest level. And what we do know is that once you get past 2, 3, 4% body weight loss in fluid loss, there's an impairment in performance and in physiological capabilities. We start to see that decrement. And some of that issue can actually be seen cognitively too. So when you think about skill sports, basketball, football, where you have to make split-second decisions, especially later in the game towards that fourth quarter, what you could start seeing is an impairment in you being able to make that split-second decision just because of that dehydration that's starting to build up. So the more that you can be prescriptive and being able to manage that and maintain, we're going to expect you to have some level of dehydration, but keeping that in check can help perform at a super high level. And not to get too deep into the work that we do and not to promote Gatorade and GSSI too much, but I do think we have a fantastic capability that's now broadly democratized and available for the entire world to go out and purchase and utilize, is what's deemed our GX sweat patch, which you put on your arm. You go out and do an activity, and it's attached to your smartphone, and it detects what you did. You can put in your either workout, or it can detect it through a fitness wearable. And then the patch has 2 microfluidic channels in it that capture sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration. It does it through a little microassay in the patch. Actually detects chloride, which is attached to sodium. Take a picture of it, and then our algorithm in the app can tell you what your sweat rate is and how much your sodium is. So you don't need a professional individual with all the fancy tools and assay capabilities coming to assess it. You can now do this through a patch that's available at Dick's Sporting Goods and available online, and you can do this yourself, and you can do it in a variety of different sessions too. You can go do it in a hot environment, you can do it in a cool environment, you can understand those differences. And we do provide recommendations, but I think just knowing that in itself can help anybody figure out what they really should be consuming in that sense from a hydration perspective. So a very long-winded answer, but I think that there's a lot that goes into that and probably really into the core competence here.
Well, certainly there's a lot of more wearables coming out, and I saw Gatorade came out with that sweat patch, and I'm interested to see how that continues to play a factor and people continue to wear it. And I saw Whoop straps. I don't know if you've probably heard of them before. I saw Patrick Mahomes. They had Patrick Mahomes' heart rate during the AFC Championship game, and I think it's going to be more and more interesting. And I think it's become more in the public eye of just the idea of like understanding your performance during an activity and trying to change it and make sure that you're performing at the level that you want to. And it's going to be interesting to continue to see overall, and I know we could continue talking for hours probably about that, but I would say just as a summary, what do you think the biggest nutritional factor that affects overall muscle recovery and growth? Like what are, you have this, you work with all these people, you have this lab, like what is probably the biggest nutritional factor that you think would affect overall recovery?
Proper nutrition across the day too. We can get into the specifics of kind of nutrient timing. But I think that's when we talked about it earlier, if you look at a 0 to 100 scale, that nutrient timing is that top 5%. Same thing with supplements, top 3%. But if you're getting your daily nutrition properly from a macro and micronutrient perspective, that's a tall order. That's very challenging. And a lot of people don't even know where to start. And we have a variety of different exercise demands and needs that we have to be met, and it makes it confusing. Like, I did this, I didn't do this, and every day is slightly different. So that's very, very challenging. But at the end of the day, like those are the biggest pieces. And as far as recovery perspective, I mean, I will always go to protein and carbohydrate replenishment. So we do know that for muscle growth following breakdown due to athletic activity, strength training, whatever it is, maintaining that 1.6 grams per kilogram per day of total protein intake, typically spaced out across the day as much as you can, anywhere from 3 to 6 meals even, is going to be really key. So if you break that across 6 meals, you're like 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram per meal, which can be consumed immediately after exercise if you want. Doesn't have to be. It's probably not as important if you're only exercising once a day to hit that nutrient timing super well. If you're doing multiple sessions in a day, it's going to be even more important to make sure that you're giving your body the proper fueling needs. And then carbohydrates, it goes back to fueling for the work required. I've said that several times across this podcast, understanding, what your carbohydrate needs are, and doing a little bit of digging into, if you're going out and you're exercising for 30 to 45 minutes, probably not necessary that you need to, consume carbohydrates during exercise. But if you're hitting that hour and a half, 2 hours, you're going to deplete your muscle and liver glycogen, and giving that additional fuel availability not only will help performance, but it allows you to train harder and longer, which then is got to cause more adaptations for your body. So it can be advantageous in that sense. So that's where you start getting into that 30 to 45 grams of carbohydrates an hour. And most commercial foods at this point, whether you're going to go with the Gatorade endurance gels or other ones, they're mostly in that space. But you do need to make sure your gut can handle that, because that's one thing that can be damaging to, specifically kind of in an endurance or even in a team sport setting. If you're not used to consuming foods and fluids during exercise, especially if there's carbohydrate, there's not as much blood flow in your gut and in your intestines to help with that, because it's been diverted to the working muscles, and your body can kind of cramp and have some adverse reaction. So there can be some training that kind of specifically goes into that.
Yeah,
The host of, sorry, I was just going to quickly wrap this up with saying there's also a host of different supplements that may be advantageous in that setting too. But unless you're hitting, like I said, that core base nutrition, the supplements are just kind of putting a band-aid on a fire hydrant.
Yeah, I was going to say that maybe perhaps, when we're talking about supplementation, it's important to understand that everything else has to be going right, and in order for you to supplement appropriately. Like that's like when you said like 1% better or 2% better, 3% better at the high performance level, that's given that they're performing well, they're doing all the other things generally correctly, and that's when the 1% will change. And maybe to summarize kind of what we're talking about, are these nutritional changes, are these performance things, and everything about recovery, is it important for just the layman person? Is this something that people should be really focused on as more stuff comes out, wearables and so on? Should people even be thinking about this? Or is it more of like something that if you are actually somebody who works out consistently, someone who does everything right, then this is something that you need to consider?
I think if you're going to use it for a positive intent, then yes. If it's something that's going to cause additional stress to you of like, hey, I didn't get my workout in and my rings didn't close, or my app is saying this or whatever, like if that's just going to stress you out, then it seems like that's going to be a negative psychological side of things, and we already know that increased stress isn't great for our bodies anyway. So I think it's so context driven. If it's something that you like to see the data, you want to be interested in it, go for it. I personally do enjoy it. I also don't feel bad when life's too hectic for me and I don't get my exercise in, for example. But if it's something that is going to cause a negative effect on you, I would suggest not doing so. That's my 2 cents on it. But if you use it for the good, go for it.
Well said. Well said. Well, Eric, I really appreciate you taking the time to answer all these questions. I mean, I know we could definitely continue talking on so many various topics and so many interesting areas, but I kind of want to summarize with some of the final questions that I ask everybody. And I gave you a little bit of time to look at these last couple questions and think about them. And this is the health me to health you portion of the podcast. And so the first question I ask everybody as well is, if you had the attention of everyone in the world for 30 seconds, what would you say?
I love this question, by the way. And I'm not sure I'm profound enough to really capture the attention of everybody in the world, or interesting enough, to be honest. But I do think that the one thing I would try to get out is that it's consistency over perfection. And that's across all facets of life, whether that's, and we're talking a lot about nutrition and physical activity and fitness today. You're going to be better off if you're just consistently doing things well than being absolutely perfect across the weeks, the days, the months, the years, etc. being consistent over the course of a year is way better than being perfect for a week.
I definitely need some of that. I need some of that advice in the back of my head sometimes, because sometimes it's difficult to make sure you're being consistent over a long period of time.
For sure.
Second question. What book do you recommend, whether book you're reading now or in the past?
So I've recently and currently reading this book by Brad Stulberg called The Practice of Groundedness. And it's a bit about what he terms kind of heroic individualism, which is just the constant needing to succeed in your personal and professional life. I'm not sure that I have exactly what he's talking about, but as I've become a father and tried to manage my work, my life, my family, everything that's ongoing, it's a piece that I feel like I'm pulled in so many different directions, and just sometimes being grounded and just reading some of the tidbits and the suggestions and the behavior change capabilities in it has been helpful for me. So I've found it very useful. I think it even is pretty impactful for the current state of our world. That for me, it feels like the speed at which information and knowledge and business is going right now has accelerated through COVID. And that's something to take note of, and figuring out how to kind of take a step back and be grounded in kind of where we are and what you're doing is even more challenging, as our attention is pulled to multiple devices and screens that we're constantly on, and being able to be present in the moment. So I'm not fully through the book, but I've thoroughly enjoyed the reading thus far.
No, well said. In any profession, I'm sure, I felt overwhelmed with some of this information that comes out just alone in my profession, but then alone, you got to worry about everything else. So I'm going to take a look at that book myself. So I'm excited to read that one. Last question: where can people learn more about you, what we talked about, perhaps the Gatorade Sports Institute, perhaps just link in some stuff that people can find you at?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can follow me, connect with me there. I'm not quite active. I'm as active as I probably should be on social media. I do have a Twitter account. So Eric Freese, you can find me there. So, happy to connect with people, have those conversations. If you want to know more about some of the things we talked about, high level, more in-depth scientific level, we have a lot of great resources on our website, gssiweb.org. We publish, updates in what we call sports science exchange articles regularly. Try to publish 5 to 6 a year, whether that's internal experts or external experts across the globe in different sports nutrition and sports science areas. It's a great resource and tool to dive into. So I think that's a great spot for people to check out.
And all the links will be in the show notes, so don't worry. You can just check it out underneath there. And I've also checked out some of those research articles and the videos on the Gatorade website. So you guys should definitely go check it out. It's all great information. But Eric, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Mike, it's a pleasure. I know it was a long time coming, so I really appreciate it. It was super fun to chat with you today.